The airport buzzed with an endless stream of people. The PA system called out flight announcements. Hurried travelers wove through the crowds, and the rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases filled the air. At the heart of this chaos, a man stood calmly in the first-class check-in line. He was dressed casually, dark jeans, a simple blazer, and a leather satchel that looked like it had been through many journeys. He was Benedict Cumberbatch. To most, he looked like any other passenger, an unassuming traveler blending into the crowd. But anyone who paid close attention would notice the air of quiet confidence around him. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't checking his phone or looking around impatiently. He simply stood, present in the moment, as if he had all the time in the world. A few places behind him in the queue, a sharply dressed man adjusted his cufflinks, glancing around with an air of self-importance. Richard Donovan was a high-powered executive, a man who measured his worth by his wealth, his connections, and how many people recognized his importance. Today, however, his gaze settled on the man in front of him, a man who looked ordinary. "First class?" Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His voice carried an edge of disdain, as though the very idea of someone so modestly dressed sharing his space was an insult to exclusivity. Benedict turned his head slightly, catching Richard's gaze with a calm, neutral expression. "Yes," he replied, his tone even. "The world is full of surprises." Richard smirked, sensing an opportunity. "I suppose you never really know who might end up here these days." The boarding call sounded, and the first-class passengers were invited to proceed. Richard confidently strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. But as he made his way down the aisle of the plane, he slowed, double-checking his ticket. His smirk faded when he realized who was seated right beside him. "You've got to be kidding me," Richard muttered under his breath, as he dropped into the seat next to Benedict. Benedict gave him a small, polite nod. "Looks like we'll be traveling together." Richard exhaled sharply, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Determined to re-establish dominance, he turned to Benedict after the plane had taken off. "So what do you do?" he asked, his voice dripping with casual arrogance. Benedict adjusted his seatbelt and replied smoothly, "I work in film." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Indie films? Commercials?" Benedict smiled slightly. "Something like that," Richard chuckled. "You know, some industries are just harder to break into. Not everyone is meant for the top." Benedict looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Maybe success isn't just about being at the top." Richard leaned in slightly. "Come on, we both know how the world works. It's about who you know, what you have, and how well you use it." Benedict tilted his head, as if considering the words. "Is that really all success is?" Richard smirked. "You tell me. You work in film. How many people actually make it big? A handful? The rest just disappear." Benedict nodded slowly. "And yet, some of the most remarkable people I've met weren't chasing fame or fortune. They were chasing something more meaningful." Richard scoffed. "Like what? Passion? Dreams? Those don't pay the bills." Benedict studied him for a moment before replying. "No, but integrity does." Richard leaned back, crossing his arms. "Integrity? That's rich. The world rewards those who take, not those who wait." Benedict smiled knowingly. "Or perhaps those who build, not those who simply consume." As the flight attendant came by, Richard made sure to order the finest champagne, enjoying the indulgence of his status. When it was Benedict's turn, he simply asked for water. Richard scoffed. "Water? In first class? That's a bit dull, isn't it?" Benedict took his bottle with ease. "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Richard shook his head. "That's what people who settle for less tell themselves." Benedict gave him a measured look. "Or maybe they're just more content." Richard frowned. "Content? With what?" Benedict gestured slightly. "With who they are." Richard laughed. "You must have a fortune. If I had that, I wouldn't be sitting here sipping water." Benedict took a thoughtful pause before speaking. "I suppose that's the difference between us. My wealth isn't what defines me." Richard rolled his eyes, but something in Benedict's tone unsettled him. "Yeah, well, in the real world, perception is everything." Benedict's gaze remained steady. "Maybe, or maybe in the real world, character is what lasts." A short while later, the flight attendant returned, addressing Benedict with a polite smile. "Mr. Cumberbatch, the captain asked me to extend his regards and confirm your connection in London." The name rang out like a shock wave through the first-class cabin. Richard stiffened. His eyes widened as recognition dawned on him. "Cumberbatch," he murmured under his breath, suddenly feeling a lump in his throat. Benedict nodded at the flight attendant in thanks, then turned back to Richard with the same composed demeanor. "Is something wrong?" Richard swallowed hard, trying to mask his embarrassment. I didn't realize," he stammered. "You didn't say." Benedict tilted his head slightly. "Would it have changed anything?" Richard's face burned with shame. He struggled to find the right words. "I didn't mean any offense. I didn't know who you were." Benedict sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Richard, how you treat people shouldn't depend on who they are. It should depend on who you are." Silence settled over them. The passengers who had been eavesdropping exchanged knowing glances. Richard sat motionless, his mind replaying every condescending word he had said. In his attempt to elevate himself, he had only exposed his own shallowness. As the plane prepared to land, Richard turned to Benedict, his voice quieter, more sincere. "I owe you an apology, not because of who you are, but because of how I acted." Benedict studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that. The first step to change is recognizing our flaws." When they disembarked, Richard watched as Benedict moved through the terminal. Unlike Richard, he didn't need to demand attention. His presence alone commanded respect. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt something new, the desire to be a better person. And in that moment, he understood the lesson he had unknowingly received. A lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet power of true success. True greatness is not about wealth, status, or appearance. It is about character. How you treat others speaks louder than any achievement. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to check out more inspiring stories that will challenge your perspective and warm your heart. See you in the next video.